attacking and demonising those who oppose them. And we need to be very sharp in our arguments in order to convince people who will waver in the face of that propaganda. There's a certain element that will fight these and oppose them and don't need to be convinced. We know that. Many of those are people who are involved in the fight against bin charges, the fight against the household tax, and who more generally have been involved in one way or another in resistance against the austerity that has been imposed by this government and the last government on behalf of the Troika. So there is a considerable, in my opinion, layer of activists out there in every town, in every county, and every part of every big city who are looking to get organised and fight. But that layer, it's significant, but it's a minority. And the key is, how do we win the majority? First of all, to agree with us that we need to fight these things, and second of all, to convince them that it is actually worth the fight, that it is possible to win. And that's what I think all of us have to think about. And I want to say from the outset that neither I nor anybody else has a blueprint or a magic formula about exactly how that's going to be done. Sometimes these campaigns and discussions get too hung up on the question of precisely this or precisely that tactic. To my mind, we have to be imaginative, we have to be creative, and we have to, crucially, we have to learn through the discussions that we have with the other people that we are trying to win in. What is it they're willing to do? If we can convince them to fight, what is it they're willing to do? Because that is the key. I can have the best idea about what it is we need to do, but if you can't convince the majority of other people to do it, it's meaningless. It's irrelevant. Right? So we have to listen to people, we have to get out and engage with people in very, very large numbers, and we have to move them into some form of activity against these water charges. Now, as I said, I think to try and do that, there's two pillars, or there's two legs to what we have to do. One is to convince them that the government propaganda is nonsense. Now, I know I don't have to convince people here, so I won't spend much time on it. But I think that the two primary arguments they are going to use to justify the introduction of water charges is one, the issue of we have to have charges because we need water conservation and we need to invest in the water infrastructure. And Enda Kenny has repeated this endlessly. He says, and we agree, that 40% of the water is leaking out of the pipes. And this is his justification for introducing charges, because he says we have to fix these pipes, and he's right, and there is no other way to pay for it other than through the introduction of water charges in order to fix the water infrastructure and ensure that we have clean water, a secure supply of water and so on for the whole country. Now, we have to be clear in rejecting that argument that, yes, we agree we need massive investment in the water infrastructure, but it's not about whether we fix the pipes, it is about how we fix the pipes and how we pay for fixing the pipes. That is the issue. And nobody, again, disputes that it costs money to fix the water infrastructure. It's going to cost billions to pay for the water infrastructure. But what we obviously have to get out and convince people is that user charges are not a fair way to do it. And in fact, the model of user charges will lead to privatisation and mean that even though people will pay through the nose for their water, in fact, the water infrastructure won't get fixed. If you look at, for example, Britain, when they privatised the water system over there, using precisely the same arguments, we need investment, the only way we can get the investment is by getting charges in. When water was privatised in Britain, investment in maintaining and fixing the water infrastructure dropped. Didn't increase, it dropped. Because, of course, once you begin to operate on a for-profit basis, well then, investment into the water infrastructure cuts into your profit margin. It isn't profitable to fix the water infrastructure, to fix the pipes. It's more profitable to charge people excessively for the dilapidated system that you have already. And in fact, flooding increased in Britain after privatisation, water pollution and water quality, all of these things worsened as a result of privatisation of water in Britain. So we need to familiarise ourselves with those facts and be able to hit back in the radio debates that we have or whatever to say, in reality, these private companies, now okay, they'll say, but Irish Water is not going to be a private company. And again, we have to be clear in saying why once you introduce charges, you're on the certain road, the absolutely certain road to the privatisation of water. Part of the reason for that is, under EU law, once you start to charge for a service, others are allowed enter into the market. And if you're subsidising the service, which at least initially the state is proposing to do, because they're talking about, although we don't know the exact amount of the charge, they're talking about 240, 250 on average, but what's called the full cost recovery of running the water system is in excess of €600, right? So that means, A, we can be certain the charges are going to move very fast up towards €600. They're only bringing them in at the lower level in order to soften the blow of introducing them in the first place and get people used to paying. But for as long as there's any degree of subsidy being given by the state to Irish Water, other private companies could say, we want in on the action as well. And under EU rules, they can sue the state if it fails to allow other private operators into the market. So once that dynamic takes off, and that's exactly what happened with bins, and it's why all of the local authority bin services were eventually privatised. Because once the local authorities introduced charges, companies that wanted to or already were in the waste management business said, we want into that market. And we either demand the same subsidies or we demand that there should be no subsidies at all. So that there's a level playing field in the market, right? So it's all about the market again, and EU rules for competition for profit. That's what's going to happen, without a shadow of a doubt. That is going to happen once charges are introduced, just as happened with bins, or anything for any, what is called in EU jargon, a revenue-producing monopoly. It has to be open to competition under EU rules. So no matter what the government say at this stage, that it won't lead to privatisation, it absolutely will lead to privatisation. So we need to know about these facts and be able to hit back when they say, oh no, it's not going to lead to privatisation, these guys are only scaremongering. Of course, we have the very concrete example of the bin charges. Similarly, they're going to come back and say we have allowances for people, that there's going to be possibly waiver system, waivers of some kind or another for those who are disabled or on lower incomes or unemployed or whatever. And again, we have to point to the example of the bin charges. All of these things were there at the beginning, but within a few short years, all of the waivers were done away with, and the charges for bin collection went up rapidly. And exactly the same will happen with water. And so, we need to be clear about all those things, but also we need to be clear in saying that this way of paying for the investment in the water infrastructure we need is an unfair and regressive way of paying for it. We all agree it has to be paid for, but there's fair ways to pay for things and there's unfair ways to pay for things. And user charges disproportionately hit the less well off. Because €200 or €300 or €400 is a hell of a lot of money for somebody who's unemployed or who's on minimum wage or who's on the average industrial wage, but it is nothing for a millionaire or somebody on €150,000 a year. So user charges favour the rich. It means that less well-off people pay a far higher proportion of their income for these services than do the rich. So what we want is to pay for these things through progressive taxation, based on ability to pay, and where we have a tax system that forces the rich to pay their fair share of taxes. And so we have to nail the lie in order to convince people, and people will have heard the debates endlessly on Vincent Brown and everywhere else, where are you going to get the money? Right? They keep trying to cover up the fact that the wealthy in Irish society have a lot of money. And they call us cloud cuckoo economists and all the rest for saying that if you tax the rich, you can get the money in different ways. So we need to be clear on this. But just to give you a few examples of where we could get the money. I put in a parliamentary question to Michael Noonan, the Minister for Finance, just before the summer recess, asking how much money would be raised if we introduced 3 new bands of taxation over 100,000, where people between 100 and 140,000 would pay 50% tax, between 150,000 and 180,000 would pay 55%, and people over 180,000 would pay 60%. Right, just on the earnings over that. 3 new bands of taxation still would leave those people very rich. That one measure alone, the Department of Finance had to admit, would raise over €900 million a year. Right, so that is one simple measure, a fair and progressive measure that could be taken in order to pay for the water infrastructure and indeed a lot of other things if the rich were willing to pay their taxes. The European Commission at the moment, in one of the few sort of vaguely half-decent things it's proposing, is trying to introduce a financial transactions tax where big financial institutions that trade in stocks and shares, places like the Irish Financial Services Centre, would pay a 0.1% tax on their financial transactions. 11 countries in Europe have signed up to this. Ireland is resisting it and saying no, we won't, because they don't want to do anything to annoy their mates in the Irish Financial Services Centre. People like Dermot Desmond, the big banks and so on that operate in there. That measure alone would raise €500 million a year. At minimum, probably more in fact, because there's about $2.5 trillion worth of assets going through the Irish Financial Services Centre every year. So my point is there are alternatives, but we'll need to be able to spell those out and say this is the alternative way you could get this money, and the fair way you could get this money. And there's others. I won't go into them. We've talked about a wealth tax on assets over €1 million and so on, which could yield hundreds of millions, possibly several billion euro a year, all of which would be far fairer, and we would also argue far better for the economy, because continuously hitting low and middle income people is not just making them suffer, but it is also depressing our economy. I was talking to people beforehand about Kells, and he was saying that Kells is particularly bad hit by unemployment and so on. But I mean, of course, and I accept that point, but small towns and villages, including even places like Dunleary, are being absolutely devastated, and a huge part of it is a combination of ordinary people, those that still have a job, having no money in their pockets to spend, therefore nothing is circulating in the local economy, and therefore all the small businesses are going out of business that might otherwise employ people. And then you have banged on top of that all sorts of user charges. I mean, I was on the way here, I noticed that you have to pay 2 tolls to get to Kells, right? So, you know, we pay to go on the roads, we pay for our bins, we pay, they want us now to pay for water, we pay parking charges, we're paying some of the highest levels of VAT on every single thing we buy and sell in the shops of anywhere in Europe, right? So they're charging for us for absolutely everything. So you ask, what the hell are we paying taxes for? What are taxes for if you have to pay, you have to be charged again and again and again for these things? But all of that cumulatively adds up to impoverish low and middle income people and devastate local economies. It's contributing very significantly to devastating local economies. So we have to say, even on broader economic grounds, this strategy of user charges is unfair and economically damaging. So I think all of those arguments we need to marshal. We've got to get them into fact sheets. We have to get that information out over the coming months before the charges hit, Because we know the government and the media have a big propaganda machine. They're going to use all the resources at their disposal to get out and undermine the campaign through arguments saying we have no choice, we have to fix the pipes, and so on. So we have to have people who will distribute fact sheets that in simple language that ordinary people understand, explain why their arguments are rubbish, and why in fact there's a better and fairer way to do these things, and there are alternative ways to get the money which would be fairer and more progressive for ordinary people. So I think that is step one, really, is to win that war of hearts and minds and win the war of ideas, which is going to be waged even before the charges come in. We're not going to get the bills till January, remember. The charges have been introduced in October. So we have 6 months where we have to win people, everybody repeating those alternatives. When they hear the rubbish coming out of Enda Kenny's mouth, or who's the new Minister for Environment? I forget it. In the musical chairs, Alan Kelly, yeah, in the musical chairs of the of ministries within this government. But we have to win those arguments, and we need people to get that information out and be clear and versed on those arguments to convince their friends, their families, their communities. That, to my mind, is step one. Secondly, then, there is sort of mobilising people, getting people organised. And if, as I certainly believe is the case, it's about numbers and it's about winning the majority, then we have to employ tactics that mobilise, or have the potential to mobilise, the majority of people and get them participating in the decision-making processes, right? There's no point in us just announcing this is going to be the tactic or this is going to happen. We have to have and build mass meetings at a local level where we have hundreds of people attending those meetings and voting on proposals for action. Nothing else will give us the mandate we need in order to wage this campaign successfully. And I think if the people here commit that we are going to do that in September, to try and double or treble or quadruple the numbers here, to get 200 or 300 people in Kells, 200 or 300 people in Navan, 200 or 300 people in all the major towns of Meath, and we have to replicate that everywhere. If you multiply that by the whole country, then we have something serious. And it gives us a serious mandate. And what that, I think, some of the things, although, like I said, I don't have the exhaustive list of things that those meetings can decide, but first of all, they have to say we're against these charges, we're proposing alternatives, and we get that message out. Secondly, at the moment, we've agreed with the unions, Unite, Mandate, most of the left independent TDs and Sinn Féin in the Dáil to have a national petition campaign where, again, to get a mandate for what we're saying. And to get, we hope, hundreds of thousands of people signing a petition saying this government has no right to introduce water charges. Water is a human right. It's a basic human right for all human beings. It shouldn't be something that you can just access if you have the money to pay for it. And we want to get that petition signed by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, so that when we march on Dáil Éireann, or when we organise protests, whatever form those protests take, we can say, we have the mandate, you don't. The government does not have the mandate to do this, particularly obviously the Labour Party, who promised they wouldn't do it prior to the last election. But we need to have that mandate in order to give authority to give our authority to our demonstrations, our protests, or whatever. The other thing we're working on at the moment is trying to pull together an alliance that, at a national level, that can begin to focus all of the energy that we need to start building at the local level, but then we need to focus it at a national level. What is at the moment has been proposed, the exact details are not tied down, but we hope they will be tied down in the next few weeks, is the unions. I organised a meeting in Dáil Éireann about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which was attended by Unite, Mandate, John Douglas, who's General Secretary of Mandate, but he's also the President of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions this year, right? Now, we all know the unions have not played the role that they should have played, to a large degree because of their relationship with the Labour Party and the fact that they've been protecting the Labour Party. But John Douglas is very considerably to the left and better than Jack O'Connor or David Begg, and looks serious about trying to head up some sort of campaign. So this is a very positive development that the President of the ICTU is now involved in, trying to work with us in building a mass movement and a campaign. And they have said they're willing to put resources and make serious efforts to try and mobilise people around this issue. I don't want to underestimate the battle they are going to have with Jack O'Connor and David Begg, and the efforts that some of the trade union movement will make to try and scupper that campaign. I'm absolutely sure that will happen, but it's a good start that at least some of the better trade union leaders, and now a new president of the ICTU, are saying they want to build a mass movement with us of resistance against the water charges. So we need to build on that initiative. What they are proposing is that there will be a demonstration on 11th of October, 3 or 4 days before the budget. The budget will either be on the 14th or the 15th of October. So what we want to do is have a big activist meeting in Dublin in very early September with delegates from groups like this, meeting with other delegates and groups and campaigns and political parties who are against the water charges, to really begin the ball rolling for a mass mobilisation on October the 11th, with the aim of getting tens of thousands of people on the streets in advance of the budget saying no way to water charges, right? No way to other forms of austerity as well, but very particularly water charges at the centre of it. And we need to make a real effort between now and then to begin to get the word around that there is going to be a serious mobilisation on the 11th of October. And I think an important part of that, in my opinion, an important part of beginning that build-up of pressure, of mass mobilisation across the country, is to get cast iron commitments from particularly the opposition parties that opposition to water charges will be a red line issue in the event that they are elected and possibly forming part of a government. We need to be very, very hard and pressurising in making that demand. I mean, it is, as we know, the Labour Party have been decimated. It is highly likely that whoever is in the next time will have to look for help from most likely Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, or even mouthing at some level opposition to water charges, and some of the independents, right? So a lot of those people, because they know there's huge anger against water charges, are going to be saying we're against the water charges. We need to get them to sign in blood that they, in the event that they are part of a government, they are not going into a government that introduces water charges, that stands over water charges. And if we can wring some of those commitments in advance of the elections against the background of a mass movement, that can have a significant impact and effect on their capacity to administer the water charges or to put them under pressure to abolish them. So that's broadly what we're proposing. I'll leave it at that. But really it will depend on people here being willing to put in the energy and effort over the next while to build up the momentum and the head of steam in advance of the budget, so that we don't just wait for them to land the bills on our doorsteps and are fighting a defensive fight. That moment will come and we will have to discuss how we respond to the bills. I would certainly like to see a mass boycott, but we can't wait until the bills arrive to get the campaign up and running. If we're going to have a chance of an effective campaign, we have to have mass mobilisation before the bills hit and before even use the water charges, and try and create a political crisis again for the Labour Party in particular. Just a very, very last point I want to make, and I'm sorry for going on, Seamus, is I'm absolutely convinced we can do this, right? And one good, positive example is what happened in Bolivia recently. The most effective campaign against water charges and water privatisation was waged in Bolivia in the last few years. And it followed exactly along the sort of lines that I've just talked about. It was an absolutely massive mobilisation of the majority of people across Bolivia when the government actually privatised and sold off the water infrastructure to American multinational companies. To the extent that the private companies were even charging for the water that came off people's roofs. Right? They were claiming ownership of the water that came off people's roofs. There was an enormous popular mobilisation against this on the basic principle, this water is a human right. It's our resource. It belongs to us. It is not something that should be bought and sold as a commodity by private companies. And that simple idea gained traction among the majority of Bolivian people, and the cities rose up all across, starting actually in the rural areas and then spreading into the big cities. And for 2 years there was a level of mass mobilisation, of civil disobedience, of occupations of squares and cities and public buildings all across Bolivia, and it forced eventually the government to reverse the privatisation, take the whole water system back into public ownership and kick the American multinationals out of Bolivia. And it was done. And it was done through that simple idea: water is a human right, and a mass of people are going to mobilise in order to defend their resources and their human right to water. And I hope we can do the same over the next 6 months, year, whatever it takes.